Harlan Grant was a man guided by the ideals of law and equity. In his mid-50s, he carried himself with a quiet confidence shaped by decades of experience in the judicial system. From the moment he rose each day, he reminded himself of his responsibilities, to interpret the law fairly, to uphold justice without fear or favor, and to ensure that prejudice never found a foothold in his courtroom. As a district court judge, Grant took pride in the oath he'd sworn many years ago. He believed deeply that the legal arena should serve as a place where truth could emerge untainted by bias. The sight of his black robe, trimmed at the edges from years of wear, was, for him, a symbol of both authority and humility. Each time he donned it, he felt the weight of the role he played in the community. Grant's demeanor was typically calm, even measured. Former colleagues and present-day clerks often remarked on his patience, telling stories of how he would listen intently to both sides of an argument before uttering a single word of judgment. This measured approach had earned him a reputation for fairness. People who entered his courtroom, whether they were plaintiffs, defendants, or mere witnesses, felt they would be treated with respect. Despite this overall patience, Grant had a personal line that he refused to let anyone cross: bigotry. If he sensed that a legal argument or personal statement harbored racist, sexist, or otherwise prejudicial undertones, his normally placid expression would harden. More than once, he had firmly admonished a lawyer or litigant for attempting to leverage stereotypes in their arguments. Off the bench, Harlan Grant was private yet approachable. He lived in a modest home surrounded by tall oak trees in a peaceful part of the city. On weekends, he could often be found walking his golden retriever, Chester, through the winding trails of a nearby park. Those who recognized him from the news or from prior court appearances would sometimes stop to chat. Grant would politely engage, though he never boasted about his position. For him, being a judge wasn't about status or power. It was about serving as a gatekeeper of sorts, protecting the integrity of the legal system. In a world so often marred by social inequalities and divisiveness, he strove to be a voice of reason. Every case on his docket represented an opportunity to apply the law transparently, no matter the social standing of those involved. In his introductory remarks, whether speaking at a legal seminar or addressing a group of law students, Grant would stress that justice must be impartial. He'd recount stories of mentors who had impressed upon him the necessity of putting aside personal biases. Time and again, his quiet passion came through when he described the core principle that drove his work: all people, regardless of background or belief, deserve to be heard and judged on the merits of their case alone. Above all, Judge Harlan Grant wanted to embody the very concept he championed: fairness. He knew that every step he took, every word he spoke in court, contributed to or detracted from the public's faith in the law. And so, with a self-possession forged from countless hours on the bench, he carried on, patient with the world's complexities, yet firmly resolved to stamp out prejudice wherever it tried to take root. It was early on a Saturday morning when Judge Harlan Grant decided to stop by the Harborview Market. The air was crisp, and the aromas of fresh produce and homemade pastries wafted through the rows of colorful tents. Known for its lively atmosphere, Harborview Market was something of a retreat for Grant, an informal therapy to wind down after the pressures of a demanding workweek. That particular day, he arrived still wearing the formal black robe he had worn at Brookville Elementary's Career Day event. He had spent the morning speaking to enthusiastic 4th and 5th graders about the importance of law and justice, demonstrating that judges weren't just distant figures on television. It was a role he cherished, showing young minds that a courtroom, while solemn, was also a place where fairness could flourish. As he moved from stall to stall at the market, Grant was greeted by vendors who recognized him. Some offered friendly waves, others called out with an extra sample of fruit or cheese, teasing him about his fancy attire. He responded with a warm smile each time, a bit amused himself at the sight of a Robe judge casually sampling homemade jam. He paused at a stall displaying ripe tomatoes, their plump, red skins glistening in the morning sun. Just as he picked up a few to inspect, he felt a tap on his shoulder. A kind-faced woman named Angela, who ran the stall, asked, "Tough day in court, Your Honor? Or just making a fashion statement?" Her tone was playful, reflecting the easygoing rapport Grant had established with the local vendors. Grant chuckled, carefully setting the tomatoes in a small paper bag. Fashion statement, obviously. My stylist recommended it, he said, playing along. In truth, he'd had no time to change before heading over. The hush of the early weekend hours was fleeting, and he wanted to catch the best produce before the market grew crowded. For Grant, these small interactions were a way to stay grounded. Too often, judges could become isolated, seen only behind a bench or in official capacities. By making an appearance in the community, robe or not, he showed residents that he was a neighbor first, a public servant second. As he browsed further, the judge paused at a table offering handcrafted soaps and lotions. The vendor, a retired teacher, immediately struck up a conversation about their mutual ties to education. Grant listened attentively, nodding at her stories of working in underfunded districts and children in need of proper support. Having just come from Brookville Elementary, he was acutely aware of how community involvement could shape young lives for the better. Eventually, he found himself with a basket brimming with fresh vegetables, artisanal bread, and a few jars of local honey, enough to keep his pantry stocked for the upcoming week. It was exactly the respite he needed, an hour spent strolling in the open air, exchanging smiles and casual banter, gathering goods that connected him to the region's agricultural lifeblood. As he made his way toward the exit, Grant thought about the stark contrast between this relaxed environment and the sober reality of the courtroom. In one realm, he decided people's fates based on the law. In the other, he simply existed as a regular person, someone who enjoyed fresh produce and the camaraderie of neighbors. Both worlds enriched his perspective. Soon, however, this peaceful interlude would collide with an incident that tested not only his patience but also the principles he stood for. Judge Harlan Grant had just paid for a loaf of sourdough bread when the commotion began. He noticed, from the corner of his eye, a woman striding purposefully toward him. She wore a determined expression, as if on a mission, and clutched a small purse against her side. His first thought was that she might recognize him from court, perhaps she had been a plaintiff, a defendant, or a witness in one of his recent cases. But her demeanor suggested something else entirely. She stopped a few feet away, eyes narrowed at the black robe draped over his shoulders. Without preamble, she said in a sharp tone, "That's quite the costume you're wearing. Who do you think you are?" Grant blinked. He wasn't used to such a confrontational approach, especially not here in the relaxed setting of Harborview Market. He started to offer a polite greeting, but the woman cut him off. "You're prancing around like you're some big shot," she accused, looking him up and down. "Are you trying to fool people into thinking you're a judge or something? Because that's not going to fly with me." A couple of onlookers began to gather, sensing tension in the air. Grant kept his voice calm. "My name is Harlan Grant. I am, in fact, a judge, district court. I just came from a school career event, which is why I'm still in my robes. I can show you my identification if you'd like." Rather than softening, the woman's stance became more hostile. "Identification? Nice trick. Con artists always carry something fake around. Let me guess, you printed it off the internet?" She folded her arms, face set in a deep scowl. Grant studied her for a moment, trying to decide how best to de-escalate the situation. He sensed there was more behind her aggression than simple curiosity. Perhaps she was having a bad day, or maybe she harbored mistrust toward anyone in a position of authority. "My ID is official," he said gently, producing the plastic card from an inside pocket. It bore the seal of the state and his photograph, along with the title, District Court Judge. He held it out for her to inspect. She glanced at it briefly, then scoffed. "Anyone can forge a piece of plastic." "I'm not an idiot," she snapped. "Look, buddy, you'd better stop pretending before you land yourself in serious trouble." By now, at least a dozen curious shoppers had formed a small semicircle around them, including Angela, the tomato vendor, and a few others who recognized Grant's face. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, some people whispering that he really was the local judge, others wondering what on earth was going on. Grant noticed the woman's knuckles whiten around the strap of her purse. She seemed genuinely convinced that he was impersonating a judge. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she'd had a run-in with a scammer before. Maybe she didn't believe men of his age or background could hold such a position. However, speculation wouldn't resolve the standoff. "I assure you, I'm not trying to fool anyone," he stated, voice level but firm. "What's your name? Maybe I can clarify this if we just talk." She eyed him warily. "Naomi Baxter," she responded after a pause. "And I don't need clarifying. I've seen plenty of posers in my life, and I know the signs. The arrogant posture, the phony ID, the holier-than-thou attitude. Trust me, I'm not buying it." Grant exhaled, trying to maintain his composure despite the oddness of the situation. On any other day, he might have laughed it off, but the intensity in Naomi's eyes made it clear she was not joking. With the crowd watching and her voice growing louder, he understood that a calm approach was essential. "Ms. Baxter," he began, "you have every right to question someone you think is breaking the law. However, you're mistaken in this instance. I've practiced as a judge for over 15 years, and this robe is standard judicial attire." Naomi glanced around at the onlookers, some of whom nodded in agreement, clearly recognizing Grant. But she appeared unswayed. "If you're so legit," she said pointedly, "why on earth would you be walking around a farmer's market in your robe? Judges don't prance around in public like that." He decided to be transparent. "I was volunteering at Brookville Elementary's Career Day, speaking to kids about the justice system. I came here right after, and I haven't had a chance to change. That's the entire story." "Sure," Naomi countered, sarcasm dripping from her voice. "And I'm the Queen of England." Grant could almost hear the collective intake of breath from the onlookers. At least one person tried to step forward to defend him, but the judge gently lifted a hand, signaling them to remain calm. If he pressed too hard, it might escalate Naomi's suspicion. "I have my official documents, and many people here can attest that I really am Judge Grant," he said. "Perhaps we can step aside and discuss this more quietly." Naomi narrowed her eyes, glancing around once more. "I don't think so," she replied. "People need to know there's a fraud among us." What began as a simple misunderstanding was rapidly snowballing into a public showdown. Grant felt a twinge of anxiety. He prided himself on staying composed under pressure. Years in the courtroom had taught him that a calm presence could diffuse most volatile situations. Yet, even with that poise, he was beginning to wonder how far Naomi would take her accusations. She was adamant, unwavering, and seemingly determined to expose him for a crime he hadn't committed. And though he respected that citizens should be vigilant against impostors, her hostility struck him as extreme. Little did he know, this confrontation was only the prelude to a more significant clash, one that would echo well beyond the Harborview Market's bustling stalls. No sooner had Judge Harlan Grant attempted a diplomatic resolution than Naomi Baxter declared, "You know what? I'm done talking. This is a crime, and I'm calling the police." She pulled out her smartphone, tapping the screen rapidly. Grant stood there, bread loaf tucked under his arm, feeling a surge of disbelief. He glanced around at the onlookers, many of whom wore expressions of equal astonishment. A few stepped forward, whispering to Naomi that she was mistaken, that the man in front of her truly was the local judge. But she brushed them aside, phone to her ear, voice rising. "Hello, 911. I need to report someone impersonating a public official, yes, right now, at Harborview Market," she said sharply, rattling off the address. She shot Grant a triumphant look, as though she'd cornered a dangerous criminal. A hush fell over the onlookers. Angela, the tomato vendor, approached Grant and softly asked, "Should we do something?" "We all know who you are." Grant shook his head, forcing a small smile. "Let's remain calm. The authorities will come and sort this out." He spoke with confidence, but inside he felt a twinge of frustration. It was one thing to be accused of impersonation, it was another to be publicly humiliated in a place where he usually found solace. Naomi ended her call, sliding the phone back into her purse. "They're on their way," she said tersely. "Guess we'll see whose story holds up." Grant tried once more to reason with her. "Ms. Baxter, I can assure you that when the officers arrive, they'll confirm my identity. You'll see that this is all a misunderstanding." Her expression was resolute, arms still crossed. "Misunderstanding? That's exactly what scammers say." It was a surreal moment for Grant. He had dedicated his career to upholding justice and protecting citizens' rights. Now, he found himself at the mercy of a misguided individual who refused to believe any evidence presented. An undercurrent of worry nagged at him. What if the responding officers, unfamiliar with him, shared Naomi's skepticism? He glanced around at the small crowd. A few people murmured among themselves, some obviously anxious about the confrontation, others quietly amused at the bizarre turn of events. Despite the tension, Grant noticed that a majority seemed prepared to vouch for him if needed. That gave him a thread of reassurance. Minutes passed, feeling more like hours, until the sound of sirens approached. A pair of patrol cars pulled up at the edge of the market, and two uniformed officers emerged. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s, the other, a younger woman with sharp eyes and a poised stance. They made their way through the onlookers, scanning the scene for whoever had reported the emergency. Naomi wasted no time flagging them down. "Officers," she cried, pointing an accusatory finger at Grant, "this man is pretending to be a judge. He even has fake identification. I'm sure it's illegal to pose as an officer of the court." The taller officer, whose name tag read Rios, turned to Grant. "Sir, may I ask your name and see some identification, please?" he asked, his tone polite but professional. Grant nodded, producing his official ID for a second time that day. "My name is Harlan Grant. I serve as a district court judge. I can also provide my courthouse contact if you'd like to verify." Officer Rios examined the card, scrutinizing it closely. Then he exchanged a look with his partner, who seemed to recognize something about the name or the credentials. "Judge Harlan Grant," the partner said quietly. "Isn't he the one who presided over the Riverside embezzlement case last month?" Grant nodded once. "Yes, that was me." Naomi, standing off to the side, let out an incredulous snort. "They're obviously in on the scam if they're falling for that. Just check the courthouse for a real ID," she insisted, her voice tinged with exasperation. Officer Rios lifted his radio and murmured something into it, presumably requesting confirmation. Meanwhile, the younger officer opened her own phone, likely searching a database. As they waited, Grant remained composed, though he could feel the weight of the stares upon him. Finally, the radio crackled with a response. Officer Rios listened, then handed the ID back to Grant. "We've just confirmed that Harlan Grant is indeed a district court judge, sir," he said, sounding slightly embarrassed that it took an official check. "Your identification checks out with the department's records." A ripple of relief passed through the gathered bystanders, many of whom nodded or whispered in satisfaction. Naomi Baxter, however, looked stunned, her cheeks flushing with either anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. Grant exhaled, meeting her gaze. "I'm sorry this has been so upsetting," he offered, although he wasn't certain if an apology was what she needed. Officer Rios turned to Naomi. "Ma'am, it appears there's been a misunderstanding. Judge Grant isn't impersonating anyone. He's exactly who he says he is." Naomi's mouth opened and closed, as though she couldn't quite find the words. Eventually, she managed, "That's impossible." At that moment, the younger officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, calling 911 under false pretenses is a serious matter," she said. "You accuse this man of a crime without any real proof. We'll need to document this incident. I'd recommend you apologize for the confusion." Naomi looked as though she'd swallowed a lemon. Her eyes darted around, seeking a sympathetic face in the crowd, but found mostly disapproval. The hush that had fallen over the market was broken by the shuffle of feet and a few quiet comments of support for Grant. Despite the tension, the judge remained gracious. He understood that the situation had been born of ignorance or perhaps a personal bias. But in that moment, the best he could do was let the officers handle the immediate fallout. Naomi seemed unwilling to concede her mistake, but the wheels of reality were already in motion. Little did Grant know, the events of that morning were just the beginning of a larger saga that would come full circle months later. For now, though, he simply hoped to salvage what remained of his peaceful Saturday. Sourdough loaf still clutched under his arm as the market crowd began to disperse. In the aftermath of the police verification, Officer Rios and his partner, Officer Archer, looked visibly relieved to have resolved the confusion. The tension that had gripped Harborview Market moments before seemed to ebb, replaced by a low hum of murmured conversation among the bystanders. "Judge Grant," Officer Rios began, returning the ID card with a slight bow of his head, "my apologies for the inconvenience. We had to check the records to ensure everything was in order." Grant accepted the card with a polite nod. "No offense taken, officer. You were doing your job." He turned his attention to Naomi Baxter, who lingered a few paces away, arms still crossed protectively over her chest. Her expression flickered between indignation and discomfort. It was clear she still struggled to accept that the man she'd accused was, in fact, a genuine district court judge. Officer Archer cleared her throat, addressing Naomi. "Ma'am, I'm afraid this situation calls for a formal record. We'll need your statement regarding the reasons you believe Judge Grant to be impersonating a public official. However, based on our verification, it seems you made a false accusation." Naomi's face tightened, a stubborn set to her jaw. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she retorted. "How was I supposed to know? People lie all the time." Grant understood that she might feel embarrassed, but her defensive stance only fueled the onlookers' disapproval. Angela, the tomato vendor, shook her head softly, while others murmured that Naomi should at least own up to her mistake. Officer Rios gestured to the walkway leading out of the market. "Ma'am, we'll speak to you over here for a moment," he said. "Afterward, we strongly suggest you apologize to Judge Grant for the trouble." Naomi hesitated, sending one last glare in Grant's direction before following the officer to a quieter spot by a row of empty stalls. The crowd began to disperse in earnest, though a few lingered nearby, curious about whether she would indeed offer any sort of apology. Meanwhile, Officer Archer stayed behind to ensure Grant was all right. "That was quite the scene," she remarked, exhaling. "I'm sorry you had to go through that in public, sir." Grant offered a small, weary smile. "It's unfortunate, but I'd rather have someone be cautious than let a true imposter slip by," he said, choosing a diplomatic angle. "However, it's concerning that she refused to accept any proof." Archer nodded. "She'll have some explaining to do. Dispatch records every 911 call, and she reported a serious crime that turned out to be baseless. We'll document everything in a report." Over near the empty stalls, Officer Rios was quietly conversing with Naomi. Her arms were still crossed, and Grant could see the tension in her stance. From where he stood, he caught fragments of their exchange. Something about misunderstanding, her distrust of authority, and a vague mention that, "he doesn't look like a judge." The comment stirred a flicker of unease in Grant. Had her suspicion been triggered by unconscious bias about who could occupy such a position? Finally, Rios and Naomi walked back. She appeared tense, but a glimmer of humility softened her expression. With a pointed nudge from Rios, she faced Grant. Look, she began haltingly, "I didn't mean to cause all this trouble. I guess I jumped to conclusions." Grant didn't respond immediately, giving her the space to speak. Naomi's eyes shifted around, never quite meeting his. "I'm sorry," she said, voice low but audible. "I should have listened to what you were saying and waited for the officers to verify." Though the apology wasn't delivered with great warmth, Grant acknowledged it with a polite nod. "Apology accepted, Ms. Baxter. I appreciate you taking this step." Officer Archer spoke up, "We'll finalize the report, Judge Grant. If you decide to follow up on any legal action or complaint, you have that right. But it seems this might just be a matter of misguided suspicion." Grant glanced at Naomi, weighing the possibility of pressing charges for filing a false report. It was within his legal rights, but he felt no desire to escalate the matter further. She had been rude, certainly, but also misinformed. Prolonging the ordeal wouldn't necessarily lead to a better outcome. "That won't be necessary," he said. "I'd prefer we leave this as a lesson learned." Naomi's shoulders sagged, relief evident on her face. For a moment, Grant almost felt sorry for her, wondering what experiences might have made her so quick to assume the worst. Officer Rios nodded, noting something on his clipboard before signaling to Archer that they were done. Before parting, Archer turned back to Grant. "Thank you for your understanding. We do appreciate your cooperation." Grant offered his hand, and they exchanged a brief, cordial handshake. "Thank you for your professionalism," he replied. In the span of just a half hour, a tranquil morning of shopping had transformed into a public spectacle. As the patrol cars pulled away, the market's normal rhythm slowly returned, vendors resumed their banter, customers haggled for better prices, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Judge Harlan Grant exhaled a long, measured breath. He could sense the curious eyes of neighbors and strangers still upon him. If nothing else, this incident had reminded him that ignorance, whether born of fear, bias, or simple misunderstanding, could erupt at any moment. It was also a testament to the importance of calm, measured responses in the face of hostility, a lesson he'd gleaned countless times in the courtroom. Little did he know, this fleeting clash with Naomi Baxter was far from the last he would see of her. In just a few months' time, their lives would intersect again under far more formal, and consequential, circumstances, bringing the seeds of this encounter to full bloom. 3 months had passed since the unsettling confrontation at Harborview Market. In that span, Judge Harlan Grant had handled a steady stream of civil disputes, small claims hearings, and even a handful of more serious criminal cases. The memory of Naomi Baxter's accusation had gradually faded, replaced by the ever-present demands of his courtroom. That was, until one morning when Grant sat at his desk reviewing upcoming dockets. The court clerk, Ms. Palmer, had handed him a thick file on petty theft charges brought against a defendant named Naomi Baxter. At first, he only noted the name in passing, flipping through case summaries and depositions. Then, in a sudden jolt of recognition, he realized it was the same Naomi who had called 911 on him at the market. He paused, reading carefully. Ms. Baxter stood accused of shoplifting from a local department store. Witness statements alleged she had taken several items without paying. The store's security footage apparently confirmed the event. Grant's eyes scanned the clerk's notation. The hearing date fell under his usual rotation, meaning he was the assigned judge unless he chose to recuse himself. A swirl of emotions vied for attention in his mind, surprise, curiosity, and a faint glimmer of unease. In principle, he had no desire to hold personal grudges in the legal process. He believed deeply in impartiality. Yet here he was, about to preside over a case involving a woman who had once publicly accused him of impersonating a judge. He took a measured breath, recalling his ethical obligations. Judges often recuse themselves if they feel their impartiality might be questioned. But was that truly necessary here? The confrontation months ago had been brief. No lasting vendetta existed on his end. If anything, he was determined to show that personal slights would not color his interpretation of the law. Grant picked up the phone to confer with Ms. Palmer. "This is a new petty theft case for my docket, correct?" he asked, double-checking. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "I saw the name and was going to ask if you wanted to transfer it, given your history with her." He considered for a moment. "I appreciate the concern, but I believe I can remain fair. Let's keep it on my schedule." Unless Ms. Baxter's attorney objects, I see no reason to step aside. Ms. Palmer hesitated. Understood, Judge. I'll make a note. Just be aware that sometimes the defense might try to claim bias. Grant thanked her and hung up. For the rest of the day, the file on Naomi Baxter loomed in the back of his mind. He skimmed over the arrest report. She had allegedly concealed items in a large tote bag. A store security guard confronted her as she tried to exit. When she refused to comply, law enforcement got involved. The entire ordeal appeared straightforward. Footage confirmed the act, and the guard's statement corroborated it. Part of him wondered if Naomi's suspicion toward authority figures had played a role in how she handled the situation. The store employees noted that she seemed confrontational from the start. According to their testimony, she was adamant they had no right to accuse her of anything, refusing to show a receipt or even open her bag. A week later, Grant found himself in his chambers, preparing for her arraignment. The clerk's office had received no motion to recuse, which meant the case would move forward under his supervision. When the day arrived, Ms. Baxter entered the courtroom in a subdued manner, her posture rigid. Grant observed from the bench as she took her seat at the defense table alongside a public defender. He announced the case number, verifying the defendant's identity. Naomi offered a nearly imperceptible nod but avoided looking directly at him. Her public defender entered a plea of not guilty to the charge of petty theft. Grant scheduled a preliminary hearing to review the evidence, explaining procedural details in his usual calm manner. Throughout the brief session, Naomi didn't utter a single word except for acknowledging her name. She kept her gaze fixed on the table or the defense attorney, as though the judge's bench was a void she dared not acknowledge. A pang of sympathy flickered in Grant's chest, despite everything. He recognized that the law could be intimidating, even more so for someone who had tangled with him personally in a public spectacle. Outside the courtroom, Ms. Palmer asked Grant if he felt any tension from that morning's proceedings. He admitted there was a certain undercurrent, but nothing that prevented him from doing his job objectively. If justice is to mean anything, he remarked, it must transcend personal conflicts. I can't let my feelings about our past encounter influence how I handle her case. In the weeks leading up to Naomi's full trial, depositions came in, and the evidence seemed substantial. Grant found it to be a fairly open and shut matter, from a legal standpoint. But he also knew better than to presume guilt before hearing all arguments in court. The petty theft charge carried possible fines and community service, maybe even probation if mitigating factors arose. He wondered if Naomi would come to court armed with hostility again, or if she had any regrets about their first meeting. Sometimes, a close brush with the legal system altered a person's perspective. Then again, some individuals doubled down on resentment. Grant resolved not to anticipate the worst. Instead, he would let the trial unfold as it should, every piece of testimony weighed without prejudice. Little did he know that her reluctance to face him would persist, shaping the atmosphere of the trial. Neither could he foresee the outcome's unexpected twists, which would underscore the delicate balance between justice and personal histories, showing once again that the line between the courtroom and real life was thinner than most realized. At precisely 9 a.m. on a crisp autumn morning, the bailiff called the court to order, announcing the case, the State versus Naomi Baxter, charge of petty theft. Judge Harlan Grant took his seat, giving his usual instruction for decorum. Sunlight filtered through the high windows of the courtroom, illuminating the mahogany walls and the rows of seated observers. Naomi sat at the defense table, shoulders taut, eyes trained on a fixed spot in front of her. She wore a subdued gray blazer, a stark contrast to the boldness she had displayed during their confrontation at Harborview Market. Even from the bench, Grant could sense her discomfort, though whether it sprang from guilt or the memory of their prior clash was unclear. The prosecution went first, outlining the allegations. They presented surveillance footage from the department store's security cameras. Naomi could be seen selecting various items and placing them into a large tote bag. Though she had a shopping basket at one point, she appeared to transfer items into the tote in an aisle the camera view partially obscured. The footage then showed her bypassing the checkout area and heading toward the exit. Grant watched quietly, noting Naomi's tense posture. She still refused to look in his direction, as if acknowledging him might undermine her composure. The store security guard, a middle-aged man named Adrian Collins, testified about how he followed Naomi after suspecting shoplifting. He recounted that she became combative when approached, insisting she was merely holding her belongings. When asked to show a receipt, she couldn't produce one. Throughout this testimony, Naomi's public defender, Ms. Boyd, listened intently. She asked a few clarifying questions but offered no strong rebuttals to the store guard's account. The atmosphere in the courtroom was subdued, each word echoing in the hush. After the prosecution rested, Ms. Boyd rose to present the defense. She called Naomi to the stand, prompting a brief stir among the observers. Grant raised an eyebrow slightly. Often, defendants in petty theft cases chose not to testify. But presumably, Ms. Boyd felt Naomi's direct explanation might help. Naomi climbed the few steps to the witness stand with visible reluctance. She placed her hand on a worn Bible, swearing to tell the truth. Then Ms. Boyd began with gentle, open-ended questions. "Ms. Baxter, can you explain what happened at the store that day?" Naomi took a breath, eyes still avoiding the judge's gaze. "I was shopping for some personal items. I had them in my basket at first. Then I realized I needed more space in the basket. Some items were large. I put them in my tote bag temporarily." She spoke in a halting voice, as if each sentence was a struggle. "Ms. Boyd pressed on, and why didn't you pay for them at checkout?" Naomi paused, swallowing visibly. "I got distracted. I had a phone call from my mother, who was ill at the time. I guess I walked out without thinking. The guard confronted me, and I panicked. I tried to explain." Ms. Boyd nodded sympathetically, while the prosecutor frowned. Grant watched the exchange with a neutral expression, though his mind sifted through the plausibility of Naomi's explanation. Mistaking her own items for store merchandise was a common defense in shoplifting cases, but it rarely held up once surveillance footage contradicted it. On cross-examination, the prosecutor displayed still images from the store cameras, moments when Naomi appeared to glance around before moving items into the tote. "Would you call that absent-mindedness?" they asked pointedly. Naomi only offered vague answers, often repeating that she hadn't intended to steal. Throughout it all, Judge Grant ensured both sides had ample opportunity to question each witness. He allowed Ms. Boyd to introduce statements about Naomi's personal stressors at the time, including her mother's health issues. He permitted the prosecutor to counter with evidence of her refusal to open the tote at the guard's request. In short, he methodically upheld the standards of a fair trial, setting aside any recollection of her prior hostility toward him. As the trial progressed, Naomi's discomfort became more evident. She stumbled through explanations, her gaze flicking to the prosecutor, the jury box, anywhere but toward Grant. From the bench, he took note of her demeanor. She seemed more subdued than the fiery woman who had publicly called him a fraud. By midday, closing arguments wrapped up. The prosecutor highlighted the consistency of the surveillance footage and the guard's testimony, painting a clear picture of deliberate theft. Ms. Boyd appealed to the jury's sympathy, claiming Naomi's life stresses might have led to a momentary lapse in judgment. After a short recess, the jury deliberated. During this time, Grant remained in his chambers, reviewing notes and ensuring he had all the procedural aspects correct. He refused to let personal memory of Naomi's behavior sway him one way or the other. If her guilt was proven, so be it; if not, the law would acquit her. Shortly before the courthouse was scheduled to close for the day, the jury announced they had reached a verdict. In a hushed courtroom, they filed in. Naomi stood, her face pale, arms trembling at her sides. Ms. Boyd stood beside her, whispering last-minute reassurances. The jury foreperson rose, reading the verdict aloud. "We find the defendant, Naomi Baxter, guilty of petty theft." A ripple of finality settled over the room. Naomi lowered her head, eyes still averted from the bench. Grant instructed the bailiff to maintain order, then thanked the jury for their service. Next would come sentencing, a phase in which he would decide the appropriate consequences under the law. Even as he prepared to pronounce judgment, Judge Grant couldn't help reflecting on the irony of the situation, how a woman who once accused him of impersonating a judge now stood before him, convicted of a crime. The irony, however, didn't engender any sense of triumph in his heart, only a sober reminder of how entwined people's lives could become under the auspices of the law. The courtroom was still when Judge Harlan Grant took a moment to compose his thoughts before delivering Naomi Baxter's sentence. Her conviction for petty theft had been clearly established, and now the responsibility of determining her punishment lay solely in his hands. "Ms. Baxter," he began, his tone measured yet firm, "the jury has found you guilty of petty theft. Before I pronounce sentence, is there anything you or your counsel wish to say?" Naomi, standing next to her public defender, hesitated. She glanced sidelong at Ms. Boyd, who gently encouraged her to speak. Clearing her throat, Naomi addressed the judge without meeting his eyes. "I just want to say, I'm not a bad person," she managed, her voice trembling. "I've been under a lot of stress, and maybe I made a mistake, but I never meant to harm anyone." Grant nodded. He'd heard similar sentiments many times before from defendants, some sincere, some less so. "Thank you," he said. "I've taken into account the circumstances presented by both the prosecution and your defense. Let's proceed with sentencing." He leaned forward, hands resting on the bench. For a charge of petty theft under these conditions, the law permits a range of penalties. I'm mindful that this is your first offense, and I acknowledge the personal stressors mentioned. However, theft is a serious matter. I'm tasked with fashioning a sentence that both addresses accountability and encourages rehabilitation. A palpable tension hung in the air. The prosecution watched intently, while Ms. Boyd placed a reassuring hand on Naomi's shoulder. The defendant herself seemed to steel her posture, bracing for the judge's words. "It is the judgment of this court," Grant said clearly, "that you will serve 200 hours of community service. Additionally, in light of certain incidents and statements made during the course of this case, I'm also requiring that you attend a sensitivity training program focusing on racial and societal biases. Lastly, I'm ordering you to write a formal letter of apology to the responding officers in your case." A faint gasp rippled through the small audience. Naomi's eyes flickered, and her cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth as though to protest, but Ms. Boyd quickly squeezed her arm, signaling composure. Grant continued, "I believe these conditions not only address the wrongdoing but also might help prevent future incidents. This sentence isn't meant to be vindictive. It's intended to be instructive and restorative." The bailiff stepped forward to guide Naomi through the post-sentencing procedure. Ms. Boyd thanked the judge quietly, though her face betrayed uncertainty about Naomi's reaction. Indeed, the defendant looked stunned, as if she expected a lesser penalty or a simple fine. The mention of sensitivity training, especially, seemed to spark embarrassment or confusion. After court adjourned, reporters who occasionally covered notable cases in the district approached Grant for comment. He declined politely, stating judicial ethics prevented him from discussing active cases. Instead, he returned to his chambers, letting the swirl of post-trial chatter pass him by. The conversation in the hallway, however, carried far and wide. Some observers, aware of Naomi's earlier confrontation with Grant at the farmer's market, considered the sentence poetic justice. Others commended the judge for balancing accountability with an opportunity for personal growth. Meanwhile, Naomi found herself escorted through the labyrinth of administrative tasks, scheduling her community service hours, registering for the mandatory training sessions, and arranging the formal apology letter. She balked at the notion of writing to law enforcement, but Ms. Boyd reminded her that failing to comply could result in a violation of her sentence. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and dusk settled over the city, Judge Grant lingered in his office. He stared at the files piled on his desk, next week's cases, motions from attorneys, a wave of new paperwork. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the day's events. He knew some might interpret his sentence as retribution. She publicly accused him, now he's punishing her. But Grant felt confident in his rationale. Community service was a standard penalty for first-time petty theft, especially with the evidence so clearly against her. The sensitivity training was less typical, but the judge believed in the power of education to address underlying biases that might fuel conflicts. He also recognized a deeper irony. Naomi's initial, baseless accusation had been that he was impersonating a judge. Now, her guilt was confirmed in his very courtroom. Still, there was no satisfaction in that for him, only a sense that the law had run its course. If she learned something about fairness and respect along the way, so much the better. Grant sighed, tapping his pen against a blank notepad. In his line of work, he rarely witnessed the long-term outcomes of his decisions. He could impose community service and require training, but real transformation demanded personal resolve from Naomi herself. The thought weighed on him. He liked to believe people could change if given the chance. Before leaving his office, he drafted a brief note to Ms. Palmer, the clerk, requesting updates on whether Naomi fulfilled her sentencing conditions in a timely manner. It wasn't standard procedure, but he wanted to stay informed. Perhaps it was a small step toward ensuring the sentence functioned as intended, an impetus for reflection rather than just punishment. Locked doors and darkened corridors greeted him as he finally exited the courthouse, briefcase in hand. The streets outside were quiet, bathed in the glow of street lamps. Climbing into his car, Judge Harlan Grant couldn't help but think about Naomi Baxter's journey ahead. He could guide the legal framework, but the path of personal growth lay in her hands. In the coming weeks, he would see whether his faith in the possibility of change could be rewarded, or whether skepticism was all that remained after a confrontation and a conviction that had once seemed unthinkable. A month after her sentencing, Naomi Baxter sat at a worn wooden desk in the cramped office of the community center where she was completing her service hours. She stared at a blank sheet of paper, pen in hand, dread pooling in her stomach. The court order was clear. She needed to write a formal apology letter to the officers who responded to her initial confrontation at Harborview Market, as well as to the store security guard in her shoplifting case. She had postponed this moment, finding every excuse to delay. But with her community service supervisor looming over her shoulder, she realized there was no more evasion possible. If she didn't comply, she risked violating her sentence and facing harsher penalties. At first, her pen hovered uncertainly, the words refusing to come. She felt embarrassed about her mistakes but also resentful that she was forced to pen an admission. For several long minutes, the page remained blank. Then, in a rush of determination, she began to write. "Dear officers," she scrawled, her handwriting shaky. "I want to apologize for my actions and for the way I accused Judge Grant without any real evidence. In hindsight, I see that I acted out of ignorance, maybe even prejudice. I let my assumptions get the better of me." She paused, rereading the lines. Though reluctant, she realized that the letter needed to convey genuine remorse if she wanted to be taken seriously. She confessed how her own biases had led her to believe someone in judicial robes at a farmer's market had to be a fraud. She acknowledged that she'd jumped to conclusions about the store guard during the shoplifting incident, too. As her pen scratched across the page, a strange sense of relief washed over her. Putting her admissions into words forced her to confront the irrationality of her actions. She wrote about her vow to handle misunderstandings differently, striving to gather facts before making accusations. A faint glimmer of humility found its way onto the page, though overshadowed by lingering regret. By the time she finished, the letter spanned several paragraphs. It was not flowery or eloquent, but it was earnest. She signed her name, hands trembling slightly. The supervisor collected the letter, offering a curt nod. Naomi sank back in her chair, exhaling deeply. In the coming days, she'd also attend her first sensitivity training session, another court-ordered requirement. For now, though, she felt a small but significant shift within herself. Writing out her apology forced her to see that her outbursts and accusations had consequences not only for the people she targeted, but also for her own life. Whether Judge Grant or the officers would accept her letter wholeheartedly remained uncertain. Still, for the first time in a long while, Naomi sensed the faint stirrings of self-awareness, a glimpse of growth birthed from adversity. Weeks later, Judge Harlan Grant sat alone in his chambers, a scattering of files and paperwork spread across his desk. He was finalizing orders from various cases, yet his mind drifted back to Naomi Baxter. Ms. Palmer, the court clerk, had informed him earlier that Naomi had submitted her formal apology letters and commenced her sensitivity training sessions. It seemed she was fulfilling the terms of her sentence without protest. Grant couldn't help recalling the surreal beginning of their entanglement, her accusing him of impersonating a judge at Harborview Market. How bizarre it was, looking back, that their first encounter involved a 911 call. And now, in a turn of fate, he had been the one to sentence her for petty theft, requiring both community service and a deeper reflection on bias. Leaning back in his chair, he allowed himself a moment of introspection. He felt no glee in the knowledge that Naomi faced legal repercussions. The satisfaction he did feel stemmed from seeing justice administered fairly, no more, no less. If anything, he was hopeful that the experience would lead to some growth on her part. The notion of poetic justice occasionally crossed his mind. Many had commented on how she'd once tried to expose him, only to be exposed herself for a crime soon after. But Grant never reveled in that irony. For him, the essence of law wasn't about payback, it was about ensuring that each individual received due process and, when necessary, a chance to learn from mistakes. He wondered if he would ever see Naomi again. Perhaps she'd return to the courtroom for a progress check, or maybe she would simply move on, having learned a lesson the hard way. If she embraced the opportunity to reflect on her prejudices, then the system had served its purpose. If she didn't, well, that was beyond the court's control. A soft knock on the door broke his reverie. Ms. Palmer stepped in to hand him a new file. "Another case for tomorrow's docket, Your Honor," she said. "By the way, about Naomi Baxter, I believe she's scheduled to complete her community service next month." Grant nodded, offering a grateful smile. "Thank you, Ms. Palmer. Let's hope it goes smoothly for her." As she left, he closed the file in front of him. He glanced at a small plaque on his desk that read, "Justice is truth in action." The phrase resonated more than ever. Truth had indeed come to light in Naomi's case, about her theft, her hasty judgments, and perhaps even some deeper biases. Whatever the future held, Judge Harlan Grant resolved to remain steady in his duty, a guardian of the law, unshaken by personal slights, guided by principle rather than emotion. In the grand tapestry of cases, Naomi Baxter's story was but a single thread, a reminder that sometimes, the most profound transformations began with misunderstandings, and ended with a chance for reflection and change.